Jason Hickel is an anthropologist at the London School of Economics. Originally from Swaziland, he spent a number of years living with migrant workers in South Africa, studying patterns of exploitation and political resistance in the wake of apartheid. Alongside his ethnographic work, he writes about development, inequality, and global political economy for The Guardian and other online outlets. His new book, The Divide, A Brief Guide to Global Inequality and Its Solutions, is out now. Jason, welcome to Under the Skin.
Thank you for having me, Russell.
It's an honour to have you on. You're actually a doctor.
I am, although not the kind that can save your life, sadly.
Good, because, we could talk about medicine and all that kind of stuff, but I'm much more interested in talking to you about global inequality. And I thought one of the things, after sort of like recently having had Al Gore on the show, for example, and talking about a huge issue like climate change, it's interesting, I feel, to listen to the framework within which these conversations, particularly conversations about significant change, they take place within a sort of an identifiable framework. I wonder if you could talk to us, give us a bit of an overview of global inequality, how things stand economically, how we got into this position, and then we'll sort of crack on from there.
Well, I suppose the place to start is, what do we presently think about global inequality and what's kind of happening in the world? So there's actually a dominant narrative out there that comes out of the World Bank predominantly and gets repeated in the media quite often, that global inequality on, again, a global scale is actually diminishing along with globalization. So we know for a fact that globalization has caused inequality rates within countries to get worse. But the argument from the World Bank is that on a global scale, it's getting better. So the media picks this up. Again, this happened most recently a couple of years ago, and argues that, look, globalization is actually good for the poor of the world. It's working. We should keep doing it because it's the moral thing to do. So what's interesting is if you look behind those statistics, you find that they're actually quite misleading, because they think about global inequality as if everybody in the world is part of the same big country, right? And so on that basis, it does appear that global inequality is diminishing, but only if you include China and East Asia. Now, interestingly, that's the only part of the world that has not been forcibly globalized by the Washington Consensus under US pressure since the 1980s. They've basically transformed their economies according to their own standards. So it doesn't really work to have the narrative work that way. Now, and here's the crucial point. If you look at global inequality between regions of the world, between, say, the global north and the global south, or rich countries versus poor countries, what we see is that rather than diminishing, global inequality is getting dramatically worse. Since the 1960s, the per capita income gap between the north and the south, rich countries and poor countries, has tripled in size. And that's really a dramatic condemnation of globalization, pointing out that it's just not working for the vast majority of humanity. The majority of the yields of global capitalism are going to rich countries, and I think that's a big problem.
I suppose, in a way, it would be obvious that globalization would increase inequality, as globalization is a term which really covers the power of transnational corporations to have one marketplace that's regulated in a way that's beneficial to them. So it kind of makes sense that would mean that money was traveling in a particular direction and it wouldn't be beneficial to the poorest and most vulnerable people. How are these myths sustained, Jason? These ideas like trickle down economics and mass production that ultimately all, how after sort of nearly a century are these kind of ideas sustained? Is it kind of a form of propaganda? I mean, the management of statistics, as you've already mentioned.
Yeah. First, I just want to briefly touch on what you mentioned just now with trickle down. So if you look at all of the new income generated by global GDP growth over the past couple of decades.
What's GDP?
Gross domestic product. It basically measures the increasing size of the global economy. Only 5% of all new income generated by global growth has gone to the poorest 60% of humanity. So that's an extremely slow rate of trickle down.
It's barely trickling down at all. It won't even get there. It'll be a vapor by the time it's halfway down.
That's exactly right, yeah. And economists have pointed out that at that rate of trickle down, to eradicate poverty from the face of the earth, which is what we theoretically want to be doing, would take over 200 years. That's how slow it trickles down.
If there was any intention to actually eradicate poverty, this is not the means by which you would do it then.
That is definitely true, and that's basically the argument that I make in my book, The Divide.
But there is no intention to eradicate poverty. Poverty is necessary, isn't it, for this global economic model? Hey, so you're an anthropologist. Doesn't anthropologist mean study of human behaviour?
Yes, that's anthropology. So my anthropological work is focused on a particular part of the world. That's South Africa. I'm originally from Swaziland, so it's quite close to where I'm from. And again, I look at patterns of migration and exploitation in that region. But just by virtue of having grown up in Swaziland and then moving to the States for my university and PhD, I was really grappling with this question of why are some countries so immensely rich and consume so much while other countries are so miserably poor and have been for such a long time. So I guess that's, the question of why the world is divided as it is economically has really exercised me. And that kind of led me on this really 10 or more year journey to understand more about how the global economy works and write that up in a way that the average person can understand.
So the aspect of anthropology that interests you is the movement of resources and capital and systems of dominance. And after your decade of research leading to this book of yours, The Divide, what are your most important observations? And I'm glad you said in a language that anyone can understand, because I'm anyone. So can you put it in, tell us what your most important observations are?
Well, so I want to go back to the question you asked earlier about...
No!
Well, I'm going to ultimately answer the question you just asked.
Fair enough.
You mentioned this thing about narrative, right? What's the narrative that sort of keeps the system chugging along?
Oh, yeah, that was a good question.
It was a brilliant question, actually. So, and I think that probably, the center of this narrative is that, rich countries have become rich based on their own hard work, and they have the right policies, and they're smart, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas poor countries are poor because, they have internal policy failures. Maybe they're corrupt. Maybe they have bad climates, not enough resources, et cetera, et cetera. But rich countries are very generous, and what they do is they give generously of their surplus across the divide to poor countries to help them sort of up the development ladder. And so we hear this all the time from our politicians talking about the international aid budget, the foreign aid budget. And on a global scale, the foreign aid budget that flows from rich countries to poor countries is huge. It's $130 billion per year, right? Now, that sounds like a lot of money, and it is. That's about the equivalent of all of the profits of all of the commercial banks in the U.S. combined that goes from north to south every year. But if you look at all the money that flows around the world, way more flows from south to north on an order of magnitude than trickles the other way. And I think that is really the key point that we need to make here. The aid is not flowing from north to south. It's flowing from south to north. It's flowing in reverse. So basically, poor countries are developing rich countries.
I see.
Rich countries are not developing poor countries.
So that that flows from north to south is contextualized as aid, and that flows from south to north is contextualized as good business, as economics, but really you would say it's sort of post-colonial exploitation.
Yeah, you can see it as plunder, or you can see it as tribute. But here's a really important fact. So, and this is actually quite recent data. So I guess it was in December or January, an institute in Washington, D.C. called Global Financial Integrity partnered with the Norwegian School of Economics to do the most comprehensive study of financial flows around the world ever conducted in the world in history. And what they found is that poor countries are net creditors to rich countries on such a scale that for every dollar of aid that poor countries receive from rich countries, they lose $24 in net outflows, right? I mean, so basically the South is effectively hemorrhaging wealth to the North. And this happens through all sorts of flows, like illicit financial flows, that basically corporations stealing money out of poor countries and storing them in tax havens, many of which are controlled by the City of London.
When you say stealing money, what do you mean? By what means?
Yes. So there's a mechanism called trade misinvoicing. And basically the way this works is that a company will falsify its trade invoices when it's exporting goods out of a poor country into a rich country, right? And by doing that, it can actually end up taking money offshore, putting it in a tax haven, and it's very difficult for customs to stop this. It's a practice that's been legalized basically by the WTO since 1994. Again, and the WTO, of course, is controlled largely by rich countries since they have the bargaining power. So they were able to sort of establish this rule, which is deeply detrimental to poor countries.
So these apparently neutral governing and regulatory bodies are in fact, in a way, the administrative henchmen of a system of globalization that's based on the exploitation of poorer countries.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I should write that in my next book.
No, I own that.
Patented. Yeah, so if you look at just illicit financial flows alone, then that's over $1 trillion that flows from poor to rich every year, which outstrips the aid budget itself by a factor of 10. Right, and there's all sorts of other flows like the interest payments on foreign loans that poor countries have to pay, profit repatriation from multinational companies, et cetera, et cetera.
I suppose part of your point then, Jason, is that many of these systems that we consider to be sort of objective and just are kind of administrative fictions. Perhaps the economy itself, and even something like GDP. It's just an idea. It's not an objective reality. Is that part of what you're saying, mate?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll definitely want to talk a bit more about GDP and how that is a fiction of our imagination that's become quite destructive. But just to go back to what you were saying earlier about these administrative bodies.
Like to Ronnie's sketch. He's always answering a question from one before.
Well, you mentioned these global administrative bodies, and it's not just the WTO. It's also like the World Bank and the IMF. So look at
I've never liked those acronyms. I've always thought IMF, WBO. Always like whenever I see stuff, I think they're dodgy. Are they then?
They're definitely dodgy. And here's the deal: is that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are basically the institutions that control the rules of the global economy, right? Now, and here's the thing: they're profoundly anti-democratic institutions. So rich countries, which have a minority of the population of the world, have about 50% of the vote in these institutions. The U.S. government has a veto over all major decisions made in these institutions.
That means the whole thing's pointless anyway. The whole thing's theatre.
I mean, yeah, it's a deeply compromised system, I think. It's and for me, the problem is primarily that it's anti-democratic. If you were to open up the WTO and World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to real democratic practices and give poor countries a fair voice in how the global economy is run, definitely we would see dramatic change.
You might as well get shot of them. There's no point buggering about with it. So, okay, so the WBO, IMF, all those things. I know I'm listing boxing organisations. Now, Conor McGregor, should he really be able to fight Floyd Mayweather? Clearly. Hey, give us some more of those statistics that are sort of mind-boggling, like how can an ongoing narrative be the depletion of poverty when, e.g., 1 billion people are living on less than $1 a day? And the one that sort of always clumps me in the face when I read it: the richest 8 people in the world control the same amount of wealth as the poorest half of the world's population.
Yeah, that's a killer fact. It's horrible. So I want to go to the poverty number that you just mentioned. So, and that sounds bad enough.
Of course you do. I know the system now.
That's the World Bank and the UN are telling us that the number of poor people in the world is between 700 million and 1 billion people, basically, right now. And what they've been saying is that number has been decreasing over the past 15 or so years because of the good things that they're doing, basically, through aid and so on. But if you look at how they measure poverty, there's a real problem at stake. That number comes from a poverty line. That's $1.25 per day, right? Now, scholars from all over the world have been pointing out that nobody can live on $1.25 a day. It's a totally ludicrous, immoral number. So in order to achieve the most basic levels of human subsistence, to achieve normal human life expectancy, to have a decent chance of surviving past your 5th birthday, et cetera, you have to have at least $5 per day, right? As like a moral minimum. They call this the ethical poverty line.
Could we just get below that moral minimum? I suppose so.
Exactly. So here's the thing: if you measure global poverty at that level, then it's not 1 billion people in poverty. It's 4.3 billion people in poverty, which is 60% of the world's population. And the number has been getting bigger over time, not getting smaller. And so again, I think that the narrative that we have that comes out of some of these bodies, that don't worry, poverty is diminishing, inequality is diminishing, is just not true. And if you look at the scholarship behind it, we see exactly the opposite story. And so we really have to ask ourselves, why is the global economy so fundamentally flawed? To fix this problem, to make it fairer, is going to require more than just tweaking around the edges with a bit of aid here and there, but rather fundamentally reorganizing the system.
How on earth will we fundamentally reorganize a system when the system is clearly beneficial to the people that control it?
That's a good question. So, I guess you can think about it this way, in terms of, is this possible or not? So I have lots of students, and a lot of my students come in deeply concerned about poverty and inequality and so on, and they get really interested in solutions like microfinance or foreign aid or whatever it might be. But the problem is that the solutions that they're interested in don't actually target the real structural causes of the problems that they are so concerned to address.
Yes.
If we can get messages out to these students who fill the development industry and all the development organizations that are out there that are trying to tackle these problems, that what we need is to tackle the real deep structural drivers, the actual causes of the problem in the first place, then the problem can be solved relatively quickly.
Go on.
So I mentioned one of the top solutions for me would be democracy in the institutions of global governance. So, and there are all sorts of proposals out there. I mean, this is a demand that global South countries have been making for a long time for fair representation.
It's weird because I never hear those arguments. So, like for ages, they've been going, "Can we have a bit of democracy in these world governance organisations?" And that message just never gets heard.
Never gets heard. Yeah, so I think that there's all sorts of other interesting ones. Like, for example, there's a huge wage differential between workers in the global North and workers in the global South, and a lot of that is due to the fact that multinational companies can move around the world looking for the cheapest possible labor, but workers can't move across borders as freely. Right?
Absolutely not.
Which is horrible. So what that means is that workers end up having to try to compete with each other to drive their own wages down, and that's really been
it's a horrible game.
It's a horrible game.
This is dystopian.
It is.
We're already living in dystopia.
Yes.
But we are in the global North, luckily. So that's something.
Yes, I suppose. Although it's not totally clear to me that we really deserve our privileges here. But.
And also, we're not part of those 8 people that have got half of everything, are you?
Sadly not.
So, like, as you say, it's deep structural change. Like like when I was talking to Al Gore, who was absolutely lovely, and a lot of people have said talking at Al Gore very unfairly, in my view. Like that, my main point was, how can you have significant change within a context that is designed to prohibit real change? And once when Yanis Varoufakis was here, he said that that Wolfgang Schauber said to him, democracy is okay as long as it don't change anything. So, as you are now saying, Jason, systemic change is what's required. Now, what are the what I feel like that I want this podcast to do is marshal people's attention into the correct areas. Instead of going, it would be ever so nice to have some micro banking, like your lovely students coming in on day one in their big lovely scarves and their rosy cheeks all full of optimism. Instead of that, saying, well, what is it? What ideas should we be pushing? What should we be campaigning for? Now, you've mentioned democracy at the level of global of institutions that govern global finance. That's one thing. Okay, we've remembered that. What else?
So, in order to really understand what's at stake here, I think that we have to understand how global inequality came to be as extreme as it is right now, right? So we need some of the historical perspective there.
Okay, so, I'll handle this one. A lot of people are very, very lazy. Then there's countries, European countries, where we really were an industrious bunch and we cracked on and got a lot of things done. Now, is there an alternative version?
So the alternative version is that we might want to start with colonialism, right? And if you want to look for sort of like the origins of mass poverty, it really is under colonialism, which was basically a process of mass displacement of peasants from the land and a total wreckage of local economies. So we know for a fact that during the colonial period, in most regions, real income growth per capita was about only 0.5% per year for the entire colonial period. Meanwhile, as a result of colonialism, rich countries like Britain got to grow at more than 3 times that much. And so that was a major driver of inequality. But here's the interesting point. If you want, we can go back to colonialism at some point. But in the wake of colonialism, in the 2 decades after colonialism ended in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a complete miracle in the global South. They suddenly had democracy and they had control over their own economic policies. And what did they do? They elected leftist progressive leaders, and they brought in tariff protections to protect their markets from cheap goods from abroad. They nationalized their own resources. They nationalized a lot of big companies and banks. They increased labor standards. They redistributed land from rich landowners to peasants. And with these policies, they were remarkably successful.
Were they?
So
What countries are these? Would you mind telling us, please?
I mean, it was all over the global south, but you can see it, I guess, most clearly, I suppose, in Latin America. I mean, look at what was happening in Chile and Brazil and Uruguay. You can also see it in parts of the Middle East, like Egypt. In East Asia, this is very clear as well.
So the global south, unshackled from colonialism, found its way towards policies like socialism, nationalism, redistribution of wealth, management of trade, and I suppose systems that were focused on people rather than profit. Broadly,
exactly, yeah, and they were using their national wealth to invest in things like education and healthcare, and so as you can imagine, poverty starts diminishing, and the gap between rich countries and poor countries starts closing for the first time in history. It was really a kind of miracle, and you would think that rich countries, since they always go on about wanting to develop poor countries, would be very excited about this trend, right? Finally, there's success and poverty is reducing. But quite the opposite. Actually, what we see is that rich nations feel that they're losing their access to cheap labor and cheap raw materials in the global south. And so, the access they'd enjoyed under colonialism. And so they start intervening violently by deposing a lot of these progressive leaders. So
I remember reading all those about those leaders. They're a horrible bunch.
Yes.
But I see. So globalization is just colonization by another name. Colonialization.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, but what's interesting is that the series of coups that started unfolding, led by Britain and the U.S. and France and Belgium.
What were we doing? We were funding coups to
we were either overthrowing leaders in the global south ourselves, or we were funding movements to overthrow them, or we were just supporting right-wing dictatorships to prevent democratic revolutions from happening.
God, we're so crafty, aren't we? We really love a bit of profit. We'll do whatever it takes. Go-getters, I say we are, us in the global north. So I suppose it's, that's fascinating. I didn't know that. So in a very short period of time, post-colonially, economic disparity was decreased because people obviously acted in a kind of a national self-interest, not the sort of rampant individualism and inequality producing systems that we have grown to know and love. But all of these regions were pretty much successfully destabilized, and that movement was quashed, right?
Well, yeah, the movement was quashed, but it wasn't actually by the coups. So the coups took a really big toll, right? And the most famous of these is the coup against Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973. And you can watch footage of it on YouTube, actually, bizarrely. But so even despite these interventions, the global south was still rising through the 70s, okay? But then, and the global north in the form of the G7 literally sat down around tables, leaders of the G7 sat down around tables to figure out how to stop this movement. The movement was called developmentalism, and it was very successful. And they couldn't figure out ways to sort of block this because it was becoming very powerful. In the halls of the UN, which was a democratic body, global south countries were winning new policies that were fairer for them, basically. But then in 1980, the tables turned dramatically in a single crazy event that changed the global order in one fell swoop. And that was the third world debt crisis. So basically, the U.S. Federal Reserve jacked up interest rates to really high levels, like 20%. And global south countries were heavily indebted in U.S. dollars. They suddenly were not able to pay their debts back because of the interest rate hike, and they slid to the brink of default. Now, if they were going to default, Wall Street would have basically collapsed. And so Wall Street talked to the U.S. government and said, please, you need to bail us out. You need to solve this problem. The U.S. government talked to the IMF and said, you are going to go and roll over the debts of those developing countries on the condition that they adopt what we call structural adjustment programs, which basically means liberalize your trade, cut your labor rules, cut your environmental regulations, privatize your companies and your assets, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, this is what Naomi Klein talks about in Shock Doctrine, isn't it? That these sort of global policies led to the destabilization of those regimes. Just one point I want to pick up on there, Jason. See that 20% hike by the Federal Reserve? Was that part of the scheme? How come they did that?
So that was not exactly part of the scheme, actually. That had to do with a domestic problem in the U.S. at the time. So the U.S. was suffering with what we call stagflation. Yeah, so
stagflation. Welcome to your doctor. Jason's missus is involved. Oh no, I can't show her. I'm embarrassed.
It was basically high levels of inflation but low levels of growth, and so they had to figure out some way to increase levels of growth again, because the rich people were really upset that they weren't gaining a fair income share. And so what they figured out that they could, if they raised interest rates, it would basically cause a recession in the US. It would empty out the factories, break the back of the labor unions, which were very powerful at the time, and decrease the price of labor, which it succeeded in doing. And as a result, the cost of labor in the US has not risen since 1980, if you can imagine it. So it was to solve a domestic political problem, but it had these ramifications around the world that changed the way the world worked.
Ultimately, to the benefit of the same interests, no? Because the Wall Street said to IMF, go roll over these loans. They said, we'll do it as long as you adopt these systems that are amenable to our worldview. And everyone's cushy, jobs are good. And you're very good at describing these things in a way that I can understand, because I understood that just then. Now, I'm angry about it. What are we going to do?
Yeah, I'm angry too. And a lot of, I would say most people in the world are angry.
Not as angry as me, mate. I'm fuming. I'm fuming about this.
You know, what's interesting is that people were so angry that they took to the streets in masses, right? So these structural adjustment programs caused per capita income growth rates to collapse from a high of 3.2%, which was really high for the South, down to 0.7%, basically economic crisis, right? In Africa, we saw incomes actually decline over a decade or more. I mean, this caused millions of people to be pushed into poverty. It was a complete travesty. It was the greatest single cause of poverty in the 20th century after colonialism. So people understandably took to the streets in what we called IMF riots.
Ooh,
but
yes, I remember that.
What's interesting is that, and they complained to their governments. They were like, look, stop these austerity policies. Basically, that's what they are. We want to go back to the fairer economic policies we had before. But here's the thing is that Global South countries themselves, the governments themselves, couldn't do anything about it because control over macroeconomic policymaking in these countries had been shifted to bankers and technocrats in Washington and New York, right? And so, in fact, structural adjustment had worked as a kind of bloodless coup, if you will.
Yes.
In one fell stroke, almost, they were able to establish effective control over economic policymaking processes in the Global South.
So, in a sense, democracy at the level of at the state level was irrelevant and redundant because the economic strings were held elsewhere. And from what you just said there, Jason, about economics, the economics is not some objective science, as Yanis Varoufakis said when he were in here, and as I'm learning from you, that it's just a model for maintaining inequality, that all of these systems are alterable by certain people. Some people are allowed to shift the rules, change the rules. Some people aren't, and it's a way of continually managing power.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's so important to understand is that flows of resources and wealth around the world all have to do with the rules of the global economy and who gets to set those rules, right? So in the 1980s, basically beginning then is when power over these rules was centralized in Washington and New York at the World Bank and in Wall Street and the IMF.
We've got to get rid of all them, have we?
Well, and personally, yes, I do believe that. And I don't think that's a radical position, actually, since most people in the Global South have made the same demands for a long time.
Why can't, I'm sorry for asking questions that 12-year-olds would ask, why can't some of those countries in the Global South just go, we ain't paying that stuff no more? Like, is that what happened with Greece? Is that what they did? They went, you were just like, paying you, mate.
Yeah,
why can't you do that?
No, I think that's such a good question, because the other option that Global South countries had, instead of submitting to structural adjustment, would have been to just default on their loans, right? Now, there's some problems with that. In the 1980s, somebody tried, okay? And this is such an inspiring story. There's a guy named Thomas Sankara. He was the revolutionary president of Burkina Faso, a West African country. He was a young man. He was a brilliant social reformer. He was considered the Che Guevara of Africa.
Go on, mate.
And you can listen to his speeches online. They're amazing. He's a really inspiring guy. Thomas Sankara.
Thomas Sankara.
Yeah. And Thomas Sankara, as president of Burkina Faso, stood up in the halls of the African Union in the early 1980s, I want to say. And he gave his famous speech against debt. He said, comrades, basically, debt is a form of neocolonialism. It means that the West gets to control what happens in terms of economic policy in our countries. And this is what he said. He said, here's the thing about debt. If you do not pay it, nobody dies. Right? If you do pay it, we surely die. And it was interesting because the room electrified, and he basically started a kind of revolution against debt, right?
Yeah.
And 3 months later, he was assassinated in a French-backed coup. So here's the thing: is that this
I knew it wasn't going to end well for old
never
Thomas.
ends well, does it? Poor Thomas. He was a good-looking guy too, I have to say.
Mate, don't objectify him. He's just come up with a brilliant bloody revolution against debt. But we will have a look at him in a minute. Oh, he sounds like a bloody hero. So a lot of these terms, right? That's interesting. So like I like that. Debt is a sort of another way of crowbarring sort of colonialism into the mix. When I was thinking about these rules, people think about these rules, these economic rules that dominate global trade and the flow of resources around the world as a sort of objective, but they are of course determined by the powerful. So we should look very carefully at these non-national, transcendent global organisations such as the IMF and other things that I keep thinking of wrestling organisations because they are setting the structures that mean that change is impossible. Another thing that just occurred to me is when people say what's the answer? Redistribution of wealth. Well, redistribution of wealth is what's been happening all along. The wealth of the South has been redistributed to the North, and of course this isn't just happening on a global level, it's happening on the level of caste and class within each of these countries, because there's loads of people, of course, look out this window here in London, Leicester Square, and you'll see people that are in the global North and it ain't going too well for them either. They're sleeping out there on those streets. Now, I suppose really what's required is an ideological shift that's the self-corrective measures that were applied in some of the countries in the 70s that brought about that economic miracle on a national level of socialism, nationalisation and protective trade tariffs. It's almost like at this point we need a way of presenting those kind of ideas on a global level, or just popularising the ideas so perhaps parties could run on them. Because I sometimes, after what happened with Syriza in Greece and, and sort of what's happening in this country with Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders in the USA, I sometimes think, well, if you did have a leader like Corbyn got in, would these global institutions prevent real change from being enacted? Would they?
Yeah.
Or are you going to answer a question from this morning?
I suppose one of the most important interventions is to cancel the debts, and I really mean that. I don't mean let's forgive some debts, which suggests somehow they sinned.
What are these debts anyway?
Well, so the debts, most of them actually were accumulated during the 1970s after the oil crisis in 1973. Basically, what it meant is that in order to fund their own consumption, global South countries had to borrow tons of money because the price of oil was so high. And so a lot of these debts are actually still hanging around since the 1970s, some even older than that. And because of the miracle of compound interest, many of them have been paid off many times over already, and yet they're still paying them off. And so it's kind of this. I mean, it's a problem in two ways. It's kind of a flood. It's like a flood of cash that goes from poor countries directly to banks, mostly in rich countries. And the other thing is it means that governments don't have effective control over their own policymaking, economically speaking. So if you cancel the debts in a radical way, which would require, of course, global South countries getting together to resist debt, to collectively refuse repayments. They can't assassinate them all at the same time.
That would look bad.
That would look bad, right? Then countries are freed up to pursue policies that are fair. It's
almost like you don't want the North or the cancelling them. You just want the South go, we ain't paying them. It's not. We're not down to you cancel them or not. We're cancelling them. We're just not paying it. That's sort of what's required. Now, I suppose what historically what the penalties have been, as you say, the assassination of people that propose those kind of measures and the replacement with regimes that are friendly to the objectives of the institutions that continue to benefit. So what's, I suppose, interesting is whether or not new alliances can be made, because I feel sort of naturally more of an affinity with the people that would be cancelling the debt rather than the debtors, even though I'm here in a lovely studio in the global North and I'm doing pretty well.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe increasingly true, because if you look at the number of people who have student debt in the U.S., I mean, that's $1 trillion of student debt right there. They also realize that there's a real problem with the debt system. And if you can start building sort of at least conceptual alliances across these different classes of debtors, then I think that you can sort of free yourself to imagine a world without it.
Cancel debt.
Yeah, exactly, or resist it.
Because one of the things I was thinking, again with Al Gore, was that we're prioritizing economic systems which are fictions or fabrications, certainly concepts that have been created by mankind, we're favouring them over actual, factual, material, physical things like the planet and meteorological systems. And again, with all this, like with what you're saying about debt management and trade manipulation, some countries have resources. So like, how is a country like Africa that's mineral rich, or like Latin America with all of its agriculture and minerals, how are they poor? If you can produce those things, then that's it, you've produced those things. Clearly what's required is, like, on one level, a different way of looking at economics on a global basis. But that's going to mean, obviously what that does is it challenges the interests of the people that are in control of the system as it currently stands. So ultimately you arrive at a point, don't you, Jason, where what is required? It's not like you've said these things out loud now. These ideas are out there. So what do? You popularise these ideas. Where does the rubber meet the road, as our American cousins say? Where does it become like, well, we're not doing this, we're not doing that, we're going to shut down this, we're going to shut down that? Who is the enemy? Who do we target? Where do I stand? What do we do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, I guess we could brainstorm right now, but but for me, the important first step is to free ourselves of these false narratives about aid and development that we have right now.
Right, good, done.
Yeah. So, and then, and again, debt cancellation, I think, is essential. Democratizing the world system is essential. I was going to mention earlier. I was going to mention the importance of a fair international wage system. So. Again, wages in the South are much lower than in the North. If and it's possible actually to bring in a kind of global minimum wage system. It would be governed by the UN through the International Labour Organization, and you would set the minimum wage at 50% of each country's median wage, and basically you would eradicate working poverty pretty much overnight. And this proposal has been made by a number of economists. We know that there's a system in place that's capable of handling it.
What's the counter argument? Why do people say you can't do that? Why, that would lead to... what's their argument for why you can't do stuff like that?
I guess their argument would be that, I guess proper neoliberals would say you should never regulate wages. But here's the way that I see it, right? If we're going to have a system where capitalism is globalized, then it only stands to reason that we need a system where the rules that regulate capitalism are also globalized.
Right, I see.
So I guess that's the way that I would.
So if you have global free movement of capital, you need global free movement of workers. If you have global capitalism, you need global regulation of the way that people are paid. So it's a really biased, messed up system. Tell me about let's have a look at some of the bogeymen of this system. Who's benefiting from this? What about companies like big billion, like super transnational companies like Apple? What's going on with them? Haven't you got some sort of terrible thing to tell us about them?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Apple is only one of many companies that only really exists because they're able to exploit very cheap labor in the global South. At some point, I think Trump even said to the CEO of Apple, you need to bring these factories back home. Was it Trump or maybe somebody else? And he was like, look, these factories are not going back home. Basically, Apple cannot has no business model.
We can't be Apple unless we've got little boys mining in Africa. Like we'd made an episode of The Truths, an online news thing we do, and it was, wasn't it, Gareth? It was some just arse-achingly terrible thing about little children are mining for this resource that's in your iPhone, and you sort of watch it and think, oh bloody hell, it's sort of unimaginable what do I want to say, sort of negligence, cruelty, irresponsibility that we don't really countenance. When you hold an Apple iPhone or an iPad in your hand, you don't think, and you're encouraged not to think of what the consequences of that are. And because haven't we already been bred and inculcated to think as consumers? I think it would be very difficult for me as an individual, although I am willing to do it, to let go of this product, that product, this privilege, that privilege. People continually, if you're not sort of basically homeless or living in a commune, people say, well, why don't you give up your car then? Why don't you give up this then? Why don't you give up that then? And I think these things are all valid arguments as part of a sort of a mobilisation of significant change. But you can see that any gestural move from any individual is of little value unless there's a sort of targeted change. One of the things I read once in Adbusters that I really liked was saying, pick a couple of corporations to really target and annihilate Like, like sort of saying, like, if you could sort of like they outlined how a few corporations have hugely transgressed General Motors with their irresponsible, not recalling cars that they knew were killing people because it worked out economically better to leave them out there and pay the lawsuits, or Philip Morris knowing for years that their tobacco was killing people, or even what you're saying there, like a big, friendly and attractive organisation like Apple, whose products I own and use and will use within the hour, and people will be listening to this podcast on those phones. We're all participating in it, but we're participating from this sort of position, it seems, Jason, of impotence. And like, I feel that because this really what we end up discussing here is narratives, the way that stories are told, that we don't think it's possible to have significant change unless we come up ourselves with stories, ideas, objectives that are accessible and attractive. Change won't happen. I don't know how to sort of start, getting people out on the streets banging a drum to bloody democratise the IMF. I don't know how to make people do that, or interest people in that even.
Yeah, here's the way that I think about it. I guess first of all, this idea of seeing about changing our own personal consumption habits, I think that is important. But what's much more important is that we organize collectively to create a system in which it's not possible in the first place that Apple can be exploiting workers like that, right? So we need a kind of collective solidarity before we just need personal responsibility. So
do you feel collective solidarity with, do you feel that as a man? Do you feel, is that something that you sort of experience? You're an anthropologist, you're an economist, you're teaching young people about this stuff. Even though you're only 34 years old, you're like some sort of gorgeous boy band professor. Sorry to objectify you, but you did it to that man in Africa. So how do you like it? So do you feel this sense, this kind of solidarity? I'm even now watching a man who I imagine is from Latin America emptying our garbage here at Global. This is everywhere. This is all around us. This is us, and I find it very difficult to get purchase, to understand what shall I do now then. And I think there is a real appetite. I think the surprising result of the last election, the success of Bernie Sanders to a degree, like all these things point to people's appetite for change. And like, it's only the fact that stories like, when I grew up, I just thought, all that coup in Nicaragua and bloody Pinochet and all that. You just think that's how things are meant to be, how it's got to be. I even like the struggle in Ireland. I sort of grew up with the view you're supposed to have, it's very difficult to get these stories out there. How do we emotionally engage people around sort of economic arguments that always feel abstract, because they are bloody abstract unless you're a little kid mining for some mineral somewhere?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. We need better and more powerful and more convincing stories. I mean, think about the power of the existing development narrative. So we need something that will tear that apart, but also, create a rival to it, right? And the thing is, there's no question that we are more inspiring and more convincing. And the thing is, I can see it in my own students, right? They all want to change the world. They have these little ideas about aid and microfinance. As soon as you explain to them how the world actually works in terms of the global economy, and point them in the direction of real structural change, they are so excited about that. And now imagine if the millions of people in Britain who are part of gap years and other student development projects or NGOs and the hundreds of billions of dollars that are in that industry. Imagine if that was channeled into making the world fairer. I mean, it would change radically and dramatically and would not require a single drop of additional foreign aid in order to eradicate poverty and inequality.
So it seems like it would be nice to have like a little 5-point plan of 5 things that would radically change the world, right? You go, right, here are 5 ideas that if these things were implemented, it would radically change the world. And then the next thing you'd hear is the people whose interests are currently being served telling you aggressively, repeatedly, why these things won't work, and then, probably they would tarnish you personally, say that you're mad and that you don't have a right to express those kind of opinions. All sorts of stuff would happen. But it would be good to distill it down to 5 simple things. So what are some of those ideas? You were saying massive debt cancellation for everybody, cancel all debt. That's a really cool one. I'd like that. I'd like to get rid of my mortgage. I'm in. And what were some of the other ones? A global minimum wage of 50% of that national median. That was a good one that we were aiming for.
Yeah.
Now say we think of a few more, because I'm literally trying to organise a global revolution during this podcast. Go on.
Yeah. So
you're the expert.
So in the second to last chapter of my book, I actually have, in fact, a list of exactly 5 things we can do to change the global economy.
Tell us them.
So we've already talked about a lot of them. We have debt. We have canceling debt. We have the changing the wage system. We have democratizing global governance of economic policy. I think that there are easy ways we can change the international trade system to make it much fairer to poor countries as well. So for example, right now, because of the WTO's Uruguay round, which came into effect in the 1990s. Global South countries are losing, on average, $700 billion in potential GDP per year because of imbalances in the WTO trading structure. And that's 7 times more than they receive in aid, right? So this is a major cause of global inequality.
The aid's irrelevant.
Aid is completely irrelevant. So in the book, I lay out ways that we can change the trade system. And then also I think that a really crucial one here is thinking about climate change, because here's the deal. We know for a fact that the vast majority of historical emissions, 70% of them, in fact, have come from industrialized countries in the West. Okay, but the vast bulk of the consequences of climate change are hitting the global South, really, really dramatically, through wildfires, droughts, et cetera, et cetera. And as a result of climate change, global South countries are losing in the region of $500 billion per year in terms of losses. And which again outstrips the aid budget by a factor of 5 there. So we need much more rigorous action on climate change to get rich countries to reduce their emissions.
All these points point to all of these proposed regulations mean that powerful economic interests would be curbed and confronted. Can you imagine them ever, like sort of history sort of looks to me like, at a glance, and that's all I've ever given it, like a sort of struggle between the powerful and the powerless, with the powerful conceding the bare minimum amount of power they can concede. All right, bloody hell, women want the vote. All right, we can't have slavery anymore. All right, okay, but they'll hang on to it for as long as they can and then give the minimum. And in each case, you would say, well, like here we are, all these years after suffrage, and women are still exploited and not paid as much as men. And in the United States, look what's happening around race and continues to happen around race. So these things, in a sense, move slowly unless there's sort of radical systemic change. And do you think it's unlikely for radical systemic change to be brought around without force and death?
Yeah, so I agree with you, and I think that basically the system we have right now is a kind of global apartheid, and it's and just as the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa required immense collective mobilization, I think the same is going to be true of this struggle. We need to abolish global apartheid, and will it end up in conflicts? It's definitely possible, and historically, when attempts have been made to make the world fairer, then that has been the case. But what is promising is that people around the global South are increasingly conscious of how unfair the system is to them, and they are the majority of the world. And the more and more that we include them in our discussions, in our discourse through the internet, through our media, etc., the more this message is going to come through.
But how do we galvanise some working class white bloke in Doncaster or indeed Essex, because they similarly are suffering as a result of this economic system, but they're not going to start thinking, identify with some bloke in Chile. How do you have a global movement? This isn't just happening in the global South. Like during the time that we've been doing this podcast, there's people, probably minimum wage worker, because this is a business that I imagine would not take the risk of paying people below minimum wage, although they'll probably outsource to a cleaning company that are using people that have, God knows how they're documented or whatever. This is not hemispherically divided. This is everywhere.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. We can definitely see elements of the South right here in the North. There's no question about it. And not just actually people from the South who are suffering, among us, but the same dynamics of the South, like slums and horrible healthcare conditions and so on, are present right in global North countries themselves.
Yeah, because you are an expert. I'm picking up from the intro on like the sort of ethnographic stuff, right? And so all this Charlottesville lark, let's call it, last week. That's sort of like why.
That's why I went to university. Can you imagine?
You're kidding me.
It's crazy.
So what do you think? Right. So what do you think about that? I mean, sort of for me, once people start parading around getting all Nazi, that's a sort of a clear indication that they feel hugely disempowered. While people say, it's under the sort of current Trump administration, people would feel that it's somehow acceptable to express more extremist views. That may be true, but also those people must be feeling something in order to do that. You and I know, and most people know, that what they are targeting is incorrect and immoral, but what they're feeling is real. They're feeling something. They're feeling anger, rage. How do we reach those people? Or do we just go, forget it, they're nutters? Or, you know what I mean? Because I don't feel that way. I feel like, these people need help.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and I'm very torn because on the one hand, I think that we absolutely have to fight fascism wherever it rears its ugly head, but on the other hand, we do have to feel a kind of compassion for at least for those who reach these conclusions because they feel immiserated or dispossessed or something like that, in a legitimate sense, right? So to the extent that there are people who turn to these narratives, these white nationalist narratives, because they feel that the system is screwing them in some real sense, because the system is very unfair. Let's be honest. I think that absolutely we have to work on building their consciousness. To the extent that these people have not been immiserated but are nonetheless still racist pricks, then we can't give them any of our compassion. I guess that's kind of the way I feel about that. Yeah.
Because I don't, I don't know why the practice is because I'm a white man, but I feel like when that sort of stuff happens and I look at their faces with those torches, I think this is weird stuff, man. And I feel like I feel we can't leave people behind. I'm not suggesting, it's obvious my allegiance lies with people that aren't marching around with torches. But I feel that unless you address the resource rage, the feeling, unless people because who should they be angry with? They're unhappy. I don't think you can get people to march around in the streets holding a torch unless there's something really seriously wrong. And unless that's addressed, then this will reformulate and remanifest the way that's clear over the course of our conversation, Jason, that the exploitation that came with colonization simply represented as globalization, that behind the mask of the previous national identity, corporate identities were able to continue the same exploitation, making little nods and gestures here or there when it became impossible to not do that. But to make significant change, you have to start dealing with what people are feeling, what's happening in people's hearts and minds and spirits. Because it's really excellent to hear you outline how these things have happened, why they've happened, and what would need to change in order for significant redistribution or a fairer society to emerge. But unless people can be emotionally engaged, I don't see how that will happen, because I think most people will have a vague idea everything's corrupt, everything's, you can't, but I think people also feel broadly impotent.
I think that another thing we have to consider here is that, the South might just take matters into their own hands, right?
Oh.
And already, I guess in a way, we're kind of irrelevant to the struggle. I mean, we in the West, we're obviously on the wrong side. So if you look at what's happening in the South already, you have in Latin America, you have a number of governments working together to form kind of like alternative trade networks that are based on fairer principles, and you have the rise of alternative institutions like the BRICS Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank that are trying to provide an alternative to the International Monetary Fund. And render these big global organizations irrelevant.
Yes.
Right now, we don't know if that's going to work, or if they're going to be instruments of sort of sub-imperial evil for the countries that run them, like China. Right?
Yeah.
We don't know, but at least that's what people are trying to do, and there's some hope there, I think.
And perhaps behind these ideas, I wonder, is like when you were saying this stuff, when you think of how we regard the global narrative, oh no, this is just the way things are. Some countries are rich, some countries are poor. It's because we got off up our arses and invented the spinning jenny, and then the VDU, and Behind sort of within this, there are sort of concurrent narratives around things like Darwinism that underwrite that kind of philosophy. Survival of the fittest. Life is a struggle for resources, and that's just the way it is. The fittest and the strongest and the best survive. These are already sort of selective narrativizations of history. The mechanistic model of the planet. The world is a bit like a machine. Evolution's a bit like a machine, selecting and making binary choices. Like, as long as we're underwritten by that kind of philosophy, then why would we be compassionate, or why would any emergent system not resort ultimately to, like you said, a sub-imperial or comparable trend? Like setting up some rival economic model sort of that China's involved in. I don't know much about China, but there's like, they don't look to me like they're front over there threading flowers for each other's hair and giving each other massages. Looks like they could be a pretty leery bunch as well if it all ever kicks off. So unless, where are the resources for these rules? Why are we going to come up with from where do we reach inside of ourselves and find a philosophy by which we can legitimately live and call ourselves human and call ourselves brothers and sisters and custodians of this planet? What is going to be the resource? And this is the bit where I go, it's spirituality.
I think that's actually so important. I think that we have to start realizing that we are all connected. That we're brothers and sisters. I think that's so essential, and it sounds so silly to say, I guess.
Yeah, because we've been taught to think it's all silly, so that people can crack on and exploit everyone. Don't say that. It's silly to be brothers and sisters. Right now, shut up. You're not brothers and sisters. You're an individual. Bye.
If globalization has done anything good for us, it's the globalization of our sense of connection. And I think that we're definitely more aware of each other right now. And I think that we need to realize that in order for us to create a world where we're able to eradicate poverty, we need to learn how to share. And I think that's so fundamental, because the narrative that we've been sold from people in power is that the only way to eradicate poverty is through GDP growth, right? But we know that on a limited planet, which is what we live on, and in an era of rapid climate change, continued GDP growth is not an option. So without growing the GDP and having some of it trickle down to the poorest, how are we going to eradicate poverty? The only way to do it is to share what we already have more fairly. And that's got to be a realization for us. None of us want to live in a world that's marked where 60% of the human population is in poverty, right? If you talk to the average bloke on the street, they're not going to want that. And so the key is to realize what's necessary for us to create an alternative world. And that really is sharing. And that's exactly the opposite kind of narrative to the one that we've been fed all of our lives.
That's right, and it's been underwritten again by different aspects of science and philosophy. Darwinism, science, like a survival of the fittest, not suggesting that evolution isn't real. Of course it is. It's empirically and provably and demonstrably real. But the implication that we should be competing with one another for resources is that's conjecture. That's just an idea. A different idea would be we should be sharing, that we are here together, that our life as individuals is not as important as our life as a community. Gal, what did you hold up a question just there, mate? What was it? And this is a question, Jason, that I've just thought up with using my brilliant little brain. Is there any hope within current global power structures? Are there any good guys? Anyone we can look to optimistically? Don't feel obliged to say me. That's already obvious.
I think there's some interesting people. I was talking about structural adjustment earlier. Crucially, the exact same policies that were imposed on the South in the 1980s are now being imposed all over Southern Europe, right? And Greece, of course, is the key example of this. So Greece is being structurally adjusted for the sake of bailing out French and German banks, basically. The same thing that happened in the 1980s for the South. And so you have the emergence of resistance there in the form of Syriza, or at least it was a kind of resistance, and Yanis Varoufakis. And
that dude's cool.
He's a cool guy, yeah, and I like what he has to say. But it's not just him. There are also people, elsewhere in the South. I think that the president of Bolivia... You
want to create a gang of global crusaders, a bit like the Marvel Avengers franchise, and I'm in it as well. And we all go around coming up with brilliant ideas, and then me sort of going into shamanic trances, preaching it all around the world.
Yes, I definitely want to do that. But speaking of shamanic chanting, I really like the point you made about spirituality, and this is why. Because I feel like, look, right now, the levels of consumption that we enjoy in the West are completely are completely based on extraction and plunder in the South. They depend on the immiseration of people in poor countries. Now, I think that actually probably plays really, really badly for our sense of psyche and our like inner well-being. I think that none of us want to live in a world like that, where deep inside we know that the things we consume and the privilege that we have depends on the suffering of other people. I think it makes us all like deeply anxious on some even unspoken level, even if we don't acknowledge it.
Yes.
And so, in order to have a kind of inner healing, we have to live in a world where our daily actions are not creating misery in the rest of the world.
That's beautiful. We need to become conscious. We need to become awake. We need to think, how happy is that phone making me? How happy are these trainers making me? Become aware. Don't be distracted. Don't lose your connection. Connect to who you really are. Any books you're going to recommend for us? Obviously, your book, which is called The Divide, A Brief Guide to Global Inequality and Its Solutions. Brief, eh?
It's
brief.
Yeah.
It's basically this, mate. I bet it bangs right on, doesn't it? How many pages?
It's like 340.
That's
with
not
notes.
brief.
I think that includes endnotes and stuff. You don't have to read those.
I won't. I'm going to tear it out as soon as I get it. That a whole bit of the back, I'm
Russell,
tearing
I
it.
brought you a copy. I'm going to sign it for you.
Oh my God. I'm not going to tear the back out. I'm going to kiss it. I'm going to kiss it and touch it and cuddle it.
I guess I would recommend, one of my favorite thinkers in this field is a guy named Ha-Joon Chang, a brilliant professor in Cambridge. And he wrote an amazing book called Bad Samaritans. And I definitely recommend that people read that.
What's his name again?
His name is Ha-Joon Chang.
Ha-Joon Chang.
Yeah, he's from South Korea.
See, I find it hard to remember non-sort of Christian sounding names. Who is that African bloke? Thomas what?
Thomas Sankara.
Thomas Sankara. We're looking him up. And what's the South Korean economist fella?
Oh, his name is Ha-Joon Chang.
Ha-Joon Chang, Thomas Sankara. Next week there will be a quiz. If you don't know anything about those two people, you will be banned from downloading this podcast, probably from iTunes. This is all part of the bloody problem. But we will use these tools one day to bring about a better world. Jason, thanks for coming on our show. You've been absolutely brilliantly illuminating, so clear, so wonderful. I feel smarter already. I've memorized some of those things you've said. What a wonderful guest you are. Thank you.
Thanks, Russell.